Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing the Wonder of Oz collection from Spellbinders. Now, I've already had two videos that I've used this collection in. I've used it for a Wonder of Oz pop-out card, and then I used the Field of Poppies embossing folder for a Remembrance Day card. But today I thought I'd just play with the whole collection and create a bunch of Wonder of Oz themed cards. So there are several different press plates in this collection. We have Dorothy and the Witches. That's a plate and die, and I love the fact that there's dies in these sets to cut them out. There's the Tin Man, Scarecrow, and Lion plate and die. There's the Wonder of Oz sentiments die, the Wonder of Oz frame and tag plate and die, as well as the Field of Poppies embossing folder. I'm going to start off with the press plates, using them in the Betterpress system with distressed watercolor cardstock. I plan on watercoloring these images for these cards. So I'm going to use the plates with that distressed watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to heat emboss the images. Now, because there's a variety of different images in here, I am going to use a variety of different embossing folders depending on which one I think works best or has the best look for the plates that I'm using. So I'm starting off with the Scarecrow and the Lion, and I am using some embossing powder tool on that distressed watercolor cardstock, inking up my plates with VersaMark ink before putting the clear plate onto the base of the Betterpress system, running it through my platinum machine to press that pattern or that plate right into the cardstock. So for these first images, I'm going to heat emboss them with some Vintage Photo Distress Glaze. Distress Glaze is embossing powder. It's just a transparent one, so if you're putting it on top of patterned paper, you'd see the pattern through it. But for this, I just like the brown color as an outline for both my Scarecrow and my Lion. I thought black would be too stark, and I didn't really want a metallic to it, so I thought using the brown would be the perfect color. So I poured that embossing powder over my images on top of a scrap piece of cardstock, tapped the excess off. Any of the excess embossing powder goes right back into the jar, and that's one thing I love about heat embossing is there's no waste with that embossing powder unless you happen to spill it, but all of the excess that doesn't stick to the image gets put right back into the jar. Then I use my heat tool to melt that powder in place. Now, whenever I'm doing watercoloring, I really like to do it with heat embossing. First off, I just love the texture that it gives, the different texture it gives with the outlines being raised and glossy. I also like it just makes watercoloring a little bit easier because you can watercolor right beside different areas, and that raised line from the embossing gives you that room to do that. You don't have to wait for certain areas to dry while wanting to watercolor beside them. So for my next two images, I'm going to be doing the Tin Man as well as Glinda. And I want to heat emboss these ones with some silver embossing powder. I thought that would work perfect for Glinda as well as working perfect for the Tin Man. So once again, I'm using that embossing powder tool, and I'm also using distressed watercolor cardstock. The only time I'm not going to be doing my press images on watercolor cardstock is for my sentiments. For that, I'm going to be doing hammermill cardstock. And then I do a background with the Wonder of Oz frame and tag set. And for that one, I used Betterpress cardstock in the porcelain color. So for any of these images that I intend to watercolor, I'm using that distressed watercolor cardstock. I just like how bright white it is, especially when I'm using white card bases. You could use another brand of watercolor paper. It would watercolor just fine, but I like the bright white, especially since when you die cut these images, it leaves a halo around them. So that halo is going to be white or whatever color of watercolor cardstock you want. And because I'm using white card bases, I like the fact that that halo is white. I just think it pops off and it coordinates best with the card base. So after tapping the excess of the silver embossing powder off, I use my heat tool to heat emboss that powder, make it go from a granular matte look to nice shiny glossy silver. So the last two images I'm doing here is Alphaba, or the Wicked Witch of the West, and then I'm doing Dorothy. Now, I don't want to do these two in the same embossing powder colors. I'm going to do Alphaba in black embossing powder. I thought that would suit her best, but I thought it would be too harsh for Dorothy, so I'm going to be using some Pumice Stone Distress Glaze. So it's kind of got gray, but with a brown tone to it, so almost a grayish to it. It's not totally gray, but so it has some warmth to it because there is some brown but again, I thought black was going to be too harsh for her. So after using my embossing powder tool, inking those plates with the VersaMark ink, press them in place, and then I'm ready to emboss them. Now, what I didn't know was I missed the bottom of Dorothy's shoes, so I end up having to do her again. When I poured the pumice stone embossing powder over top of her, there was none that would stick to her shoes, and realized I had missed a spot there. So I won't be using this image. I'll be doing it again and making sure that I actually ink her shoes for the next round. Next, I'm going to do the black embossing powder on the Wicked Witch. We're making sure to remove any powder that sticks anywhere else other than that image. Then use the heat tool to melt that powder in place. Now, you don't have to use different colored embossing powders if you don't want to. If you want to use all the same color, you can absolutely do that. And you also don't have to heat emboss the images. You could use a permanent ink that would work with watercolor if you wanted to. The only thing you have to make sure then is that one area dries before you start watercoloring beside it. Otherwise, they're going to start to run into each other. So because I messed up on the last Dorothy, I'm going to redo her. I have another piece of distress watercolor cardstock here. Made sure to ink all of her this time, run it through my Platinum 6 machine, and now I'll use that pumice stone distress glaze in order to heat emboss her. Now, you could watercolor these images before die cutting, but I chose to die cut them ahead of time so that they would all fit on my sticky mat while watercoloring. That way I could watercolor similar colored areas at the same time. So before we get to that, let's heat emboss Dorothy here. The embossing for all of the different glazes or embossing powders are exactly the same. The steps are exactly the same. The look is just different. So I really like the pumice stone for Dorothy. It almost looks a little bit like silver, but it doesn't have that metallic tone to it. It just has the nice gray, but it's a warm gray. So with her done, I want to heat emboss all of my sentiments. And because I used 4 different colored embossing powders for my images, I'm going to use 4 different colored embossing powders for my sentiments. Now, I'm not going to show them all on screen because it's going to be very repetitive, but the steps are the same for all of the different colors, and it's the same as doing the images. So here I'm using some hammer mill cardstock. I've taped it to the clear plate of my Betterpress system. Use the embossing powder tool on that cardstock, inked up my plate with some VersaMark ink, put the clear plate to the base, and run it through my die cutting machine in order to press those images in place. Now I can take that cardstock off there, put it on a scrap piece of paper, and pour my embossing powder on there. So for this one, I'm using that black embossing powder. Now you could say just do black sentiments and use that for all of the cards, but because I have different colored embossing for the images, I just thought they would look a lot better to have 4 different embossed colored sentiments for those cards. Any of the extra sentiments that I don't use on these cards, I will put in a Ziploc bag, put it right with that sentiment set. So next time I want to use it, I'll have a ton of sentiments already done, ready to go, and there might just be something that I've already done that will work for the card that I'm using. So after pouring that embossing powder on there and tapping off the excess, I can use my heat tool to melt all of that powder. I love the fact that these sets have dies that coordinate with them. It's going to make it so easy to cut all of these sentiments out at one time. So that's the one set. Then off screen, I did the other 3 colors. So we have all 3 colors here ready to go and ready to die cut. I'm going to match up the die with those sentiments. And I always tape my die cuts or dies in place before die cutting when I'm matching some either images or sentiments, because I want to make sure that it's not going to move on me. So I'm using some Best Ever Craft tape, and I just reuse the same tape pieces over and over again until they don't stick. They probably have about 5 or 6 uses to them for what I'm doing here before they don't really stick too well. So you get a good amount of use out of each piece. The only time I don't reuse my pieces of Best Ever Craft tape is when I'm using them in an embossing folder and inking that folder, because it gets ink all over it. You could wipe the ink off, but there's likely going to be some residue. So to err on the side of caution, I just toss those pieces of tape away. So after doing all of my sentiments, I'm going to die cut all of my images. And I do it the same way that I do those sentiments. I take the matching die, tape it in place, run it through my die cutting machine, and if by chance I can use 2 dies at the same time on the same piece of paper and they aren't going to overlap, I will do that. But most of the time my images are too close to each other and they end up overlapping the dies. That's the best way to ruin a die. If the die is overlapping another one, do not put it through your machine. That is going to ruin it, and you don't want to do that. Dies are expensive enough as it is. We don't want to do anything that could possibly damage them. So I end up doing all of my pieces individually. Some of those pieces would overlap. Some of them, they were just dies in different sets. So I just grabbed the ones from one set at a time and then did my die cutting. And like I said before, by having all of these pieces die cut, I can fit them all on my sticky mat to do my watercoloring. And I'm going to watercolor these with some Distress watercolor crayons. They have a ton of different colors in the different sets. I'm going to be using 3 different sets for the colors that I want to use for these. But they're really nice and easy to watercolor with, and there's no or very little mess to them. Now I chose to create my images and heat emboss them and die cut them so that I could put them on the different backgrounds. One of the backgrounds I'm going to create is with that Wizard of Oz frame and tag press plate and die set, and another 1 or 3 of them are going to be with that Field of Poppies embossing folder for backgrounds. You don't have to do them separate and die cut them. You could put them on whatever cardstock you're wanting for your backgrounds, and if you're wanting to watercolor your images, watercolor a background to go with them. So you don't have to die cut them. I'm choosing to because for the look that I'm going for and for the cards that I want to create, this is what's going to work best. I really like that white halo around them. You could use a watercolor brush to watercolor around them if you wanted to hide that halo as you're creating your cards as well. So before I start to do my watercolor, I want to create the one background. This is going to be for my first card once I have my images created. So this is that Wonder of Oz frame and tag press plate and die set. I'm using Betterpress cardstock. This is the porcelain color. I've taped it to the clear plate, and I'm putting my plate or pressing the image onto that cardstock without any ink. You could add ink if you wanted it to show up a little bit more, but I really just wanted that pattern. I'm just going to do a very simple ink blended background. It's going to show up that pattern just a little bit more, but it is going to be pretty subtle. So if you want it to be less subtle, you could put ink on that plate before pressing it to the Betterpress cardstock and then do your ink blending afterwards. So with all of my pieces embossed, die cut, and ready to go, I put them on my sticky mat to hold in place while I'm doing my watercoloring. I'm starting with Distress Watercolor Crayon Set 6. The first color I'm using here is Lost Shadow. I'm going to use it for watercoloring the Tin Man. I chose to do the Lost Shadow. You could, if you have silver ink or silver ink refill, you could watercolor it with silver to add or to have that metallic shine for the tin. But because I already have silver embossing powder around the edges, I already have that silver element to it. So just doing the watercoloring with Lost Shadow I thought was good enough, and it still has the look of tin to it. When I'm doing my watercoloring, I don't draw with the crayon at all. I use my water brush to draw the color off or to take the color off of the crayon onto the brush of my brush. And the watercolor brush that I have has water right in the barrel. So when I want to change colors, I just squeeze that brush onto the paper towel to my right and then brush those tips off there. So I have a nice clean brush to use. I'll often do my watercoloring with Distress refills for the pads. You could absolutely use those for this as well. I just opted to use the watercolor crayons because I hadn't used them in just a little while. For the handle for the axe that the Tin Man was holding, as well as the lion, I'm using brushed corduroy. This is also in set 6. So when I'm doing my watercoloring, I kind of do a bit of a wash over the whole thing, and then I'll go back in and deepen the color in some areas where I think it needs to have a little bit darker color. So right where the mane meets the body, it should be a little bit darker there. The hind leg should be a little bit darker than the legs in the front. So as I'm doing this, I'm adding a little bit more color in the areas that I feel need more color. If by chance I get it a little bit too dark, watercolor is pretty forgiving. I can clean my brush off and then use my clean brush to take off some of the excess color. You have a good while to keep manipulating the color. It does start to dry, but you do have a little bit of time. So I find that it's really forgiving. I tend to just kind of zone out as I'm doing it. For the brush corduroy that I'm using, I'm also going to use it for the Scarecrow's pants, and I also use it for his hands and his face, although for his hands and his face I do it a lighter shade, so there's very little there. I also did it on his hat, but then I looked up an image of him and realized his hat should be dark, so I'm going to be going over that later anyway, so it's going to change colors. For Glinda, I'm using some spun sugar. This is also in set 6. I'm trying to make it fairly light, but heavier where that fabric would be overlapping each other. So closer to the waist, it's going to be a little bit heavier. Where I have folds towards the bottom of the skirt of her dress, it would be heavier there as well. So I'm making it fairly light. I want it to look like it's tulle or look like it's transparent, but I also want to have some darker areas and some lighter areas for some variation. We already have a metallic part to it because it's heat embossed with the metallic silver, but I'm going to add some stickles once everything is dry to give it a little bit of shimmer to it. Set 6 also has lumberjack plaid in it, so I'm going to be using that for Dorothy's ruby slippers. And I'm also going to be using it in the bows on the mane of the lion, but I don't do it quite yet. I go in with some brushed corduroy for the basket that Dorothy is holding. As I'm doing this, I try to pay attention to what colors should be the same, but I'll often miss something, so it's easy enough to go back and change the color or add other colors. For Dorothy's dress, I'm going to be using the Stormy Sky from set number 5. Again, just like doing Glinda's dress, I'm trying to keep it one color tone to start, and then I go in and look at the places where there would be some shadow. So where the fabric creases, right where that basket is close to her body, there would be some shadow there, so it would be a little bit darker there. I will often make it a little bit darker towards the edges and lighter towards the center part of her body. Again, just a little bit of shading just gives it some color variation and makes it look a little bit more realistic. For the Scarecrow's top, I'm going to be using some forest moss from set 6, and I'm also going to be using that forest moss for Elphaba's face, or the Wicked Witch's face, as well as her hands. And then I come back a little bit later and use it for her striped stockings as well. As I'm doing this, I'm realizing some of the areas that I missed using that brush corduroy. So that's where I used it on the Scarecrow's face as well as his hands. Then I go back in with that forest moss for the Wicked Witch's hands and face. You could use other greens with it. Again, I'm trying to use as few sets as possible, but it's impossible to keep all the colors to just one set. So after doing all of those colors, I grab set number 3. It has Tattered Rose in it, so I want to use the Tattered Rose for Dorothy's skin as well as Glinda's skin. So just like the rest of the watercolor, I'll go in and put like an even coat on, and then I'll go back in and just add some shading where her face would touch or go by her hair. There'd be some shading right under the skirt. The lower part of the arms would have a little bit of shading. Again, just give it a little bit of variation. Now, with those Distress watercolor crayons, when you first use them, when they're dry, you're going to have a lot of water and very little color. And as you keep using the same colors, you're going to have a little bit more color and less water. And apparently I messed up recording the last little bits of my watercoloring, but I used set number 1. I used the black soot for the Wicked Witch's hat as well as her dress, and I used walnut stain for parts of the Scarecrow, as well as using black soot for the Scarecrow's hat. So a nice dark hat for the Scarecrow. So after doing all of that watercolor, I set that aside to dry, and now we're ready to start working on our cards. So I grabbed that Wonder of Oz frame that I did for the background with the Betterpress cardstock, and I'm just trimming it down. I'm trimming it so that I've got it trimmed right outside of the frame of the pressed image. It's really hard to see on camera, and sometimes I'll have to shave just a tiny little bit more off as I'm doing it. Once I have it trimmed down, I'm using some Modelon Distress ink for the bottom, about a third of the image. Then I'm going in with some tumbled glass for the top part, as well as going in with some Uncharted Mariner to do the top around the darker parts of the sky. My coloring here is kind of grass and sky, but you could color it with whatever colors you want. You could even use the method that I use for my Wonder of Oz pop-out card to do the front of that card and do that as a background for Dorothy. I think that would look great as well. But I wanted to do a background that was different from the one that I had already done. So if you haven't already seen that video, I'll link to it at the end of this one, give you some more ideas of what to do with that collection, and just a different way of using that Wonder of Oz frame to make it look like a leather-bound book. So after ink blending that background, and I did it really light ink blending. I didn't do a lot of heavy ink blending. So the There's No Place Like Home sentiment in the center is very, very subtle. In real life, you can see it and you can totally read it, but on camera, it's really quite subtle. Now I thought it would be fun to give Dorothy some ruby slippers. So I used the shoe dies from the Special Toast die set. This is another set or collection that's come out in the last month or so from Spellbinders. And I die cut the base of the shoes in just plain white cardstock, but I did the front parts in some glitter cardstock from the Ruby Treasure cardstock pack. This way she has some glittery red shoes. The only thing about those shoes is they have some really nice high heels to them that I highly doubt Dorothy's ruby slippers had. So I also grabbed the There's No Place Like Home sentiment. This one was done with that pumice stone distress glaze, so it matches the color of the embossing on Dorothy, and I glue that overlapping the heels of the shoe just a little bit, just so you can see the slippers, but you don't see the heel quite as much. So after that is done, I set that to the side. That card is totally done. I just love the subtle background that it has. Then I'm going to use Glinda as well as Alphaba. And for this one, my color combination for the back is really Wicked inspired. My girls and I absolutely love the movie Wicked, and we can't wait for the second one to come out. So the coloring is absolutely inspired by that. I'm doing another very, very simple ink blended background. The bottom part is going to be done with Sponge Sugar Distress ink as well as Picked Raspberry. And you can see I'm kind of going on an angle. I'm going to do the pink behind Glinda, and then I'll go in with some Mowed Lawn on the top right-ish, again at an angle, and do the background behind Alphaba. So I'm using some Spellbinders large blending brushes. I use this for the last background as well. They are good for doing light ink blending or heavy ink blending, but they're perfect for backgrounds because the brushes are so nice and large. I love using these for backgrounds. I tend to make my colors lighter towards the center and heavy around the edges. I just really like the look of the framing when you have the ink heavier around the outside edges. And you can see as I'm doing this, I'm not making it a complete even coat. Again, I think it looks a little bit more interesting when the colors have some dark areas and light areas, but that's just my personal preference. For this particular card, my ink blended background was trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. I have a black mat to go around it to coordinate with some of the black elements in some of the embossed pieces. That is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. Once I have that background glued to the base of my card, I can glue on my embossed and watercolored figures here. So I'm going to glue on Glinda first and then Alphaba on that green area. For this card, I chose the sentiment, "A Wicked Friend is or Like You is Rare." I'm going to put that on the outside of the card or the front of the card. And on the inside of the card, I'm doing "Never Doubt Your Magic." So some of these cards I have sentiments on the inside as well as having sentiments on the front. I have many, many sentiments because I did them in 4 different embossing colors, so I might as well use some extras. So those both are done with the embossing in the black embossing powder because it's going to coordinate best and it's going to show off best on this particular background. But again, a really, really simple card. The watercoloring is really quite simple too. And by doing all of the watercolored images together, I don't have to stop and watercolor another image for the next card. It's much easier to do a bunch of them all together and let them dry at once. For the next card, I'm grabbing the Field of Poppies embossing folder. I'm going to be using this embossing folder for the backgrounds for the next 3 cards. I really love this embossing folder. It's perfect for the theme of this collection, and it can be used in a few different ways. So I'm going to be using it here with some Hammer Mill cardstock. I have it taped in my embossing folder. I'm inking the background of that folder with some brushed corduroy distress ink so that the recessed areas or the background behind the poppies has a brown tone to it. I chose that one for this one because it's going to coordinate nicely with the colors that were used to paint the lion. And then I'm going to use some Candied Apple Distress ink to lightly blend on top of the poppies to make them pop out, to make them nice and red. And again, just like my backgrounds, when I'm doing that ink blending as well, I don't make sure they're all even colors. I make sure that some are dark, some are light. For me, it's just a little bit more visually interesting. So inking that folder and closing it, putting it through my machine, I do that 3 or 4 times till you get as much ink as you want on that background. You can do it as many or as few times as you want. That ink will continue to build up as you're putting it through the machine, so you can keep doing it until you're happy with the result of it. Once I have that done, I put it on my sticky mat to hold it in place while I'm doing the ink blending. And as I'm doing the ink blending, I'm doing it really light-handed, and then you can build the ink up. You can't take any ink off if you get it too heavy, so might as well be lighter handed with it, and then just build that ink up. And just like I said before, some areas are heavier, some areas are darker. My personal preference. If you happen to get a little bit of that red on the background, it's just going to darken that brown a little bit. You're going to see that there's some of that color there, but it's not going to really change the color of the background so much. The focal point is going to be the embossed and watercolored image, as well as the sentiment. The background is going to add a lot of texture, but it's not going to be the focal point of the card. So after inking the poppies, I trim that piece down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I have another piece of poppy cardstock that I trim down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for a mat around my image here. Once I glue those down, I glue down the lion as well as the sentiment. Then I realized that I had forgotten to do the center of the poppy. So I grabbed the black soot distress ink and a detailed ink blending brush and just did really light ink blending for the centers of the poppies. I want them to see the centers, but I don't necessarily want them a dark black. So I'm really light with it. It looks more like a dark gray rather than a black, but it does complete those poppies or complete that background. For the next background, I'm just using the poppy folder with some plain hammermill cardstock. I'm not inking the background for this particular one. I just wanted to show it as is, but I will do a little bit of ink blending around the outside edges just to give it a bit of a finished look to it. So after embossing it, I trim it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I always trim my cardstock, my embossed pieces down after embossing them. If you trim it down before time, sometimes, especially with really detailed embossing folders, sometimes it changes the measurements of the cardstock. And by trimming them down afterwards, I can make sure that the final measurement is what I want it to be. So for this one, I'm just using some brush corduroy distress ink to just ink blend around the outside edges. It's going to tie it in with the colors that were used for the Scarecrow, not only to do the watercoloring, but also the embossing. But it also brings out the images of the poppies around the outside edge. Frames it a little bit and brings them out a bit. I chose black cardstock for a mat around here, and that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Then I glue down my emboss piece, and I'm gluing everything with Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle. It works perfectly not only for gluing pieces down to complete cards, but it also works perfectly for gluing tiny die cuts together. I'm not going to be doing any of that in this video, but I use this glue for everything, or pretty much everything. It dries fairly quick. It starts to grab fairly quick, and it goes a really long way. So that's one of the reasons why I use it. I also love that liquid glue. Gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. So after that background is on there, I add my Scarecrow and my sentiment, and we have another card completed really quite easily. This is the last card that I'm going to be using the poppy embossing folder for my background. The technique for this one is going to be exactly the same as the one for the lion background. The only difference is I'm going to be using some mowed lawn for the background instead of using that brushed corduroy distress ink, just so you can see the difference in the two colors. Personally, I prefer the mowed lawn rather than the brown of the brushed corduroy. Either one works though. I just think it looks nice to have a different color from the poppies, as well as the fact that if we're to just leave it white and then do the ink blending on the poppies, you'd see any ink that happened to go on the background. So by using the brush corduroy for the lion card, this one for the Tin Man card, you're kind of hiding when you get a little bit of that red ink on the background. It not only adds a contrast to the poppies, but it also gives some wiggle room for doing your ink blending on the poppies. Now, if you wanted, you could leave your background like this and have white poppies, but that's not the way it is in the movie. So in my mind, it should be red poppies, but you could do, for a different occasion, do it this way and just have white poppies if you wanted. So once I have my embossed piece done, I trim that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Now I'm using that same candied apple to do my ink blending on them. And just like the lion card, when I'm doing the ink blending on here, I'm heavier in some areas, lighter in other areas. Now, after forgetting to do the centers of my poppies for the last one, I remembered to do it for this one. So I made sure to grab that black soot distress ink with that detailed blending brush and just ink blend the centers of the poppies. And just like the last time, I'm not heavy with it. I don't want some dark black dots in the middle of the poppies. Poppies. Because I have some lighter poppies and some darker ones, I want to have some more subtle centers. But there you can, right beside each other, you can see the difference between the two backgrounds. It's not a huge difference, but you can choose whether you prefer the green on the background or whether you prefer the brown, which looks better for you. And if you haven't already seen it, I've already done a Remembrance Day card with that poppy background where I used poppy cardstock with some black ink for the background. So you can check that out and see that done with those colors and see the different look that you get with that. So after doing my background and gluing everything to the base of my card, I have a mat around the piece that is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches done with anchor cardstock. Then I have my emboss piece trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches on top of there, and then I can glue on my Tin Man as well as my sentiment. For this one here, I'm using stickles for the center of the flowers just to give them a little bit of sparkle, just a little bit of a different look from the last ones. That's a step that you could miss if you want, but I just like the extra texture it gives as well as that little bit of sparkle. For my last cards, I'm using the Wonder of Oz silhouette dies. I just have it die cut in some Raven cardstock, and I'm going to do a very, very quick and simple card with some really simple ink blending on the background. I'm going to do that ink blending right on my card base. So I put it on my sticky mat. I made sure that my sticky mat was nice and clean before doing this. I don't want to accidentally pick up some ink on an area where I don't want it. Then I use some scrap cardstock to mask off the back of the card, so I'm only ink blending on the front. I start with the Spun Sugar Distress ink, doing it about 1/3 of the way up. Then I go in with some tumbled glass and finally some Uncharted Mariner. So we have a very simple but pretty inked background that's going to be nice behind our silhouette die cut. And I have that silhouette die cut out of black cardstock because I just love the look of a nice simple ink blended background with the black silhouettes on it. I think this would look great with some white silhouettes as well for something a little bit different, but I tend to prefer my silhouettes to be in black than in white. When I did the Uncharted Mariner, I made sure not only to be heavy at the top, but also to be heavy around the sides as well. Take it off of my sticky mat and we're ready to add the silhouette to that. Now this silhouette was die cut out of a piece of Raven cardstock that was 5 1/2 inches long. So when I glue it to my card base, it's going to fit from one side to the other. I'm not going to have to trim it down in any way. I also centered the die on that cardstock so that I wouldn't cut any pieces of either the Scarecrow or the lion's tail off. Last step here is to add a sentiment to the front, and I chose the one that said good friends are the best travel companions, gluing that to the front. And then on the inside of the card, I'm adding no adventure is complete without you by my side. Both of those are the ones that are heat embossed with black embossing powder, so it's going to coordinate beautifully with the black silhouette, but because it's on white cardstock, it's going to pop right off of the black cardstock or the black silhouette die cut. So again, super simple card, but that silhouette is just really striking on top of that embossed or that ink blended background. And those sentiments worked absolutely perfect to have one on the front and then another one on the inside. They coordinate perfectly together. Then we have our poppy background with the Tin Man in front of him. The sentiment I chose for that one, I realized I didn't mention it. It says good friends are the best travel companions. That one is heat embossed with the silver embossing powder. For the Scarecrow, the sentiment that I chose was experience is the only thing that brings knowledge. I figured that was appropriate because the Scarecrow didn't have a brain. And then for the Cowardly Lion, the sentiment I chose was true courage is facing danger when you are afraid. I thought that was perfect for him. I already said which ones I chose for Alphaba and Glinda. And I just love those two on the simple ink blended backgrounds. And like I said before, I chose to heat emboss and die cut these pieces, but you could have the images right on pieces for the front of your card. You don't necessarily have to have them as separate images, but I just like the look for these ones. And then that last card was that very first one that I did with the Wonder of Oz frame behind Dorothy as well as her ruby slippers. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fabulous day.